Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Reverend Jonah P. Overton, they, them, is a community organizer, creator of the podcasts Jonah and the Peacock and Christian Queeries, and the lead pastor of Zao MKE Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As a young queer and trans clergy person, Jonah has been called into ministry to build the church as queer space and organize communities and churches toward justice and liberation. All right, welcome to the show, Reverend Jonah P. Overton. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for your time. Share, if you would, anything else you'd like to share with our listeners.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you for the invitation. It's really lovely to be here. And I'm a church planter. It is my passion to start and cultivate new communities and expressions of faith, and particularly with an emphasis on relationship, story building, and the ways that collective community can have this monumental impact on the world when we can organize around the principles of the gospel.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Share, if you would, kind of about your journey of faith, what that looks like today, what that looked like in the past.
Yeah. So I grew up in a mainline Protestant denomination. My dad was a Lutheran pastor, but it was a really progressive, so he was in the ELCA, which is a very progressive form of Lutheranism. And I had some incredible examples of faith from the margins from the very beginning of my life. One of my godmothers is queer and a clergy person, and so that kind of taught me from the very beginning in the late 80s that queer people were not only blessed by God, but often called by God to do the work of the gospel and church building. I also had a pretty profound experience just observing my dad as a kid when he went to El Salvador with a number of his clergy colleagues to protect the Lutheran bishops there. There was a lot of political violence and danger. But essentially, it was, the U.S. militarism terrorizing poor villages.
Yeah.
And so I learned from a very early age that following Jesus might take you to another country, to another place, to another people, to stand with the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. And so those were really profound experiences for me. But I also then, I grew up in Chicago and then in the suburbs of Chicago, and my experience of church community was a little bit different. I never quite fit in. I was experiencing trauma and mental health issues as a teenager that I couldn't really square with my experience in the local church. And so I left the church. I wanted to have a faith. I remember having a conversation with my parents when I was about 15, basically saying, I want to believe. I respect your belief. I don't have it. And so I want to be honest about that. It just didn't feel real to me the way that it honestly did very much when I was a child. I was a really spiritual kid, but I went through this kind of valley in my adolescence. And that valley was, it was dark. I experienced more trauma and substance abuse and, just some real depths in my own mental health. And, I found my way back to a spiritual path and basically came to believe that the only way that I was going to survive that experience was connecting to God. And so I threw myself wholeheartedly in my late adolescence, when I was about 19, into the church. I found actually some church plants and campus ministries, which are not unlike church plants in many ways, but ministries that were kind of making and remaking themselves, often with young people, including young people in recovery. And that was really powerful. But it was also a very different experience of church for me because these were mostly white, evangelical, non-denominational spaces. And so that expression of faith was very different than, the kind of Lutheran mainline experience I had already. So I really came of age spiritually among evangelicals. Theologically and philosophically, I had a very different set of ideas, but in terms of spiritual practice, the tenor of worship, the emphasis on kind of an intimate incarnation, that all is very evangelical in me. As I came into my own identity, though, in my early 20s, I actually, because I felt like I had such a different theological and biblical perspective than my communities, I was like, I would like to go to seminary. I want a theological education because I don't think that I'm learning in my local church what I desire to learn. So in my early 20s, I went to seminary for the first time. But I was also getting a degree in social work so that I could work out in the community because I literally had no concept that there could be a place for me in the church vocationally or professionally. And I was coming into my own identity as a queer and trans person, as a non-binary person. And so I was like, the church has no idea what to do with me. They don't want me, but I want to learn. And so I studied theology. I started doing community organizing with a number of congregations across the city of Chicago. And I was working with more than 70 churches. And I didn't feel like there was a single one that I could fully be myself in. Because at that time, I was like, well, and I was deeply involved in justice organizing and kind of leftist justice spaces. And so I was like, I am a radical leftist, queer and trans evangelical Christian with a seminary education. Yeah. So like, where do I go? Who is my people? Like, where's my community? Yeah. And, there were always pockets of friends who were queer or queer affirming, who were trans, who loved Jesus. And then over the course of my organizing work, I did encounter another church that seemed to embody a lot of what I really cared about. Very Jesus forward, which was super important to me. My experience in the mainline is sometimes there is a reticence to talk about Jesus. A lot of talk about God, a lot of talk about love, not a whole lot of talk about Jesus. And it's just not for me, I'm a Jesus kind of person. So so I found this like very Jesus forward Methodist church that was run by a group of people, many of whom were queer, and it was a church plant. And I was like, this really is it. I don't think I had put together really that the evangelical churches of my adolescence were plants. Like in retrospect, I was like, oh yeah, there was like, it was new. It was in a church gymnasium, or I'm at a school gymnasium, whatever. Yeah. But in my mid-20s, I was like, okay, so you can just start churches. Yeah. You can start churches with different kinds of leadership, and starting churches with different kind of leadership produces different kinds of churches. Yeah. And so I was really convicted. I joined the leadership team, and I started doing a lot of discipleship and small group development. And but in discernment with the pastors, it was very clear pretty quickly, like, I'm called to do this. If I want a place to go to church, if I want a church in my community that exists for people like me, I might have to have a hand in making it. Yeah. So I actually had to return to seminary because I hadn't been pursuing a Master's of Divinity, which is the degree I needed to do church planting in the United Methodist Church. Yeah. Officially became a United Methodist, went to a United Methodist seminary. And then the winds of church planting energy and funding and expectation kind of shifted, and there wasn't that energy in Chicago anymore. And so I was called up to Milwaukee, which was a real gift because I have a lot of family here. And so I moved to Milwaukee when I was 29 with the names and phone numbers of two people who lived in Milwaukee and told to start a church. Yeah. Wow. And so that's how I that's how I arrived in Milwaukee and became to plant Zao MKE Church.
All right. Well, before we jump in more on that, and I thank you for sharing that. A fascinating journey for sure. Share, if you would, with our listeners, a spiritual practice or a spiritual discipline that's been meaningful for you or you might recommend to others.
Yeah. I think it's a little odd because I connect most in community in some pretty traditionally evangelical ways.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a hymnal singer. I feel most alive in worship when the lights are low and purple and the band is loud. And I love the connections in small groups and prayer partnerships and things like that. But on my own, the most consistent practice I've had, probably over the last, little more than a decade, is singing evening prayer, a very traditional Lutheran setting of evening prayer by myself, lighting a candle, knowing that there are people around the world, Lutherans, Catholics, many more, Episcopal, Anglican, who are also doing evening prayer and praying the hours in some form or fashion. So I think that's it's a highly liturgical thing, but it's something that's really been grounding for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I have to ask you though, like as a new church, how many churches offered you hymnals?
Yeah, oh my gosh. Yeah. So many hymnals and Bibles that were printed 60 years ago. And yeah, it's a real...
Oh, forgive me. Yeah. Been there, done that.
Yep.
All right, well, let's move on and jump into talking about the story of Zao MKE Church. So you kind of started into it a little bit. I want to hear about the name. Anything else you'd like to share about the backstory?
Yeah. So I've not always been great with names. I was a little nervous to name a church. One of the things I realized quickly, though, is that whatever a church gets named, it loses its meaning pretty quickly sometimes as it gets shortened into a set of initials or just shorthand for a community that means something to people.
Yeah.
And so I said, I want something that kind of rolls off the tongue, but also like has a depth to it that people can talk about, that people know where it comes from. So we actually talk about our name quite a lot. Zao, which a lot of folks can't spell or pronounce, is Zao, and I tell people Zao, it rhymes with wow.
Yeah, me included here.
Yeah, it's a helpful device. But it's a Greek word, and it's from the Bible. It means to be among the living, to be fully alive, and it's a word that Jesus uses, many times, including when he says our God is a God of the living. And I think it's an invitation to remember that the gospel is not about kind of making it through this life on earth and dying and getting a reward in heaven. The gospel is about coming fully alive here and now and forever. And I believe that the teachings of Jesus point to an eternal life that doesn't begin later, but is something that we open ourselves to over the course of our faith.
Yeah.
As we are sanctified, as we are brought into the fullness of our being, we are made fully alive. Yeah. And I know that from my own journey, I am much more alive now, open to, present to, and seeking after the love of Jesus than I was when I was in the depths of closing myself off to love from all directions. And so we decided, this community is a reflection of our intention to be present, to be alive here, now, and forever.
Yeah. Well, you kind of shared about this already in your faith journey, but perhaps I want to hear it again, maybe for my own sake. Like, why start a church? Like, did you have any idea like what you're tackling there?
Yeah, so I had the benefit of some years of community organizing, which was much better training for church planting than any of my seminary education.
Point. Yeah.
I knew the power of organizing people together. The scriptures say where two or more are gathered. And I think that we hyper spiritualize that sometimes, but there is a power. There's a power to bringing people together. And It's a difficult task. Church planting is an extraordinarily difficult task, and it's one that I went into knowing that whether it succeeded or failed was not necessarily a reflection on my faithfulness or my competence.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
But just, whether all of the stars would align, whether, I like to think about God's invitation a lot. I felt like God was inviting me to be a part of starting something new. And I was going to say yes to that. God was inviting my denomination to be a part of that. And they said yes. And God was inviting all of these people in Milwaukee to come and be a part of it. And some of them said yes. Enough of them said yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think like there is, whenever we're organizing anything in the name of the gospel, there's an invitation to all the pieces that need to come together for it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about whether we can achieve critical mass.
Yeah.
And so, I was really honored to feel the call to start a church, and very scared because I knew that nothing was guaranteed. But I truly felt like if I didn't, I love Jesus. I feel extraordinarily connected to my faith. I knew that my faith would be strong whether or not I had the exact right community for me, but it was still really painful to be separated, to feel alone. And I knew that there were many, many, many more people, especially queer and trans people, who had been so burned and so hurt by the church that trying to connect to God on their own just wasn't going to be functional. And so as a person with roots in evangelicalism and an identity in social justice and, queer liberation and all these things, I knew that, it's not going to work for all the queer and trans people burned by evangelical churches to just suddenly become Unitarians. Like that's not gonna, that's not gonna, we need spaces that bring together the best of the traditions that we've come from. And we need to collectively heal the wounds that our traditions' sins have caused. And so I wanted to be a part of that for myself as much as anyone else. But also because I know that there are people who desperately long to meet God with one another and look around and the church is just absent for them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fabulous. Thanks for sharing that. I'm curious, can you give me like a couple practical things about how you see community organizing like being beneficial to church planting?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a mythology we have in the church and elsewhere that, holding a good program, advertising it on Facebook or in a newsletter, just having a Sunday morning service is going to bring people in.
Right.
And I think that myth gets reinforced over and over and over again when we say things like, oh, young people are leaving our churches. Well, we need to update our music. And sure, but that's not going to be sufficient. That might help. Yeah. It might not, it has to be authentic to whatever your community is. And so I think one of the biggest obstacles to growing an organization is this mythology that programming alone is what's going to bring people in.
Yeah.
And community organizing taught me that the thing that binds people together for any kind of difficult or demanding or time-consuming effort is relationship, is love, is connection, is belonging, and identity. And so I did not rush to worship. I know a lot of people, and some people can do this successfully, but a lot of people are pushed by their organizational bodies or whomever to start a Sunday morning worship service immediately. And that's where their resources go. And, over and over again. And instead, I held a weekly gathering at my home where we did Lectio Divina and discussions. So basically, I would read the scriptures for folks, we'd meditate on it, then we'd talk about it. But the vast majority of my time was spent in coffee shops, one-on-one, hearing people's stories.
Yeah.
Crashing events, hearing people's stories over drinks or at birthday parties or at baseball games, and then meeting up with them later for coffee to talk about it more, introducing people to one another, talking about meaning and ideas and, our past and our future, and doing that in these like highly intimate individual and small group ways, and creating a sense of community that way. So we would have these one-on-ones. I would connect people to each other. And then, we'd have a barbecue or a game night where we could all be in the same space. But we didn't rush to a program because we spent an enormous amount of energy building networks of relationships.
Yeah. How long can I ask, like, from when you first started kind of going to Milwaukee with that purpose till like your first quote unquote worship gathering?
Yeah. So I moved to Milwaukee in July, again, with those two like names and phone numbers. I hadn't even met them.
Mm-hmm.
And, but my sister lived in the area. So she was my like, I think some people start church plants with like a little cadre from another church or whatever.
Yeah, especially in evangelical spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, which is an enormous support. I think that's a great way to do it. I don't recommend church planting the way that I church planted, but it was what had to happen. So
sure.
I had my sister and a couple of contacts. So I started gathering people weekly in my home in September. So it was 2 months of just talking to people weekly in my home starting in September. Those gatherings were, 2, 3, 4 people sometimes.
Yeah.
But we grew that over the course of the year. The one-on-ones, the weekly gatherings, the game nights, by the following summer. So it was a year. We were averaging 25 to 30 in my living room. And so that's when we started kind of dreaming about worship. So we did preview worship services once a month that fall. And it was a full year and a half before we started doing twice monthly worship.
Yeah.
And we did twice monthly worship, for, probably 2 years, maybe a little longer. No, that can't be right. A year and 8 months. And so we did that. We continued to grow, doing small groups and tons of events. And we were trying to grow we were at a theater. It required a lot of labor to set up, tear down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially because we were putting a real emphasis on music.
Right.
So the equipment, oh my gosh. I mean, it took us like 3 hours to set up.
Yep.
So
been there, done that.
It's rough. So I wanted to go, I think, weekly sooner. But my partner and eventual like co-planter, Cameron, who is the musician and does all the tech, was like, no, we need a home or at least a slightly better setup before we can go weekly, just for volunteer reasons. So for a year and several months, we did that, growing from an average, like our preview worship services, we came out the gate with 70, 75 people, but our weekly, when we kind of, regulated into, being in the 30s and then 40s. And then we got up to, 60s, 70s before we decided to go weekly. And through another strange course of events, a lot of other organizing principles at play there, actually, we worked our way into a church building less than a half a mile away from the theater we were worshiping at.
Wow.
Owned by our denomination, had been sitting empty for years.
Wow.
There are all kind of politics about it, but we ended up in it, and we launched weekly services in October, beginning averaging, upper 70s, then 80s, then 90s. We were worshiping 100 on average by February of 2020.
Yeah. Then what happened?
then there was a little bit of a global catastrophe. So, so we only got 5 months worshiping weekly in our building before we had to go completely virtual. And due to our community's needs and priorities, we went completely virtual for basically the next 2 full years.
Yeah.
And at this point, in the fall of 2022, we've only been back in person for about 6 months.
So I kind of review that just for my sake and for our listeners. So if I'm hearing you right, you went a year and a half of just kind of small before any kind of quote unquote formal worship gathering of any kind happened, right?
Yep.
And then was it another year and a half of twice a week kind of, or twice a month kind of formal worship gatherings? So that's to use a word, that's a lot of runway.
Yeah. I mean, it was about 3 years between me showing up and launching a weekly worship service.
Wow. So, obviously you have familiarity with mainline denominations, growing up ELCA and now working in the UMC, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So I think a big struggle that, at least I see, and maybe in my context, is the runway is not nearly long enough.
Never. Yeah. I mean, the reason that I had so much leeway really had a lot to do with a lack of oversight. I'm being perfectly honest. You know, there was the person who recruited me up to Wisconsin was really my main contact here. Mm-hmm. And he recruited me. He was very passionate. And it was like that person, the bishop knew of me and knew my credentials, but like didn't have time to deal with me.
Yeah.
And then this person, this member of cabinet, brought me up, but then vacated that position unexpectedly a couple weeks after I arrived.
Oh,
and
wow.
So the position in my church structure that was supposed to give me oversight and support was vacant for the first 8 months. And then there was like someone else, technically my district superintendent, who was supposed to be over me, who was on medical leave for a lot of that time as well.
Wow.
So like, I just completely fell off their radar. Even when another person got into that position, I wasn't on their radar. So I got, I'm super grateful. We got funding. We got enough funding to fund my full salary for the first year and a half. And then slightly less funding every year after that. But so I got financial support, enormous financial support from my denomination.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a whole lot of oversight. And so what that meant was there weren't a lot of denominational pressures. They weren't really looking at what I was doing. They weren't trying to pressure me to move faster than I needed to go. And I did have all my organizing contacts and my other church planting relationships because I had these networks of church planters. So I had a coach who is somebody who I'd worked with at his own church plant who absolutely had my back and said, yes, do not rush to worship. Do not rush to worship.
Yeah.
And I had colleagues who had rushed to worship, and I saw how much energy and time it takes to put on a quality Sunday morning service. One of my colleagues was putting on 2 of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, one in the city and one in a suburb in the afternoon.
Wow.
And, you know, overall that meant he was reaching more people, but because it was the very beginning of his church planting season, you know, he had 25 at the first service and another 25 at the second, but there was like about a 15-person overlap of people who were spending their whole day orchestrating these services. So I saw how depleting that was. And I just really prioritized depth of relationship, depth of discipleship, and then truly engaging in very public justice work and public kind of queer space. Because the other, you know, there are a lot of factors in how Zao was built. And one of them is that we are working primarily with people who have a laundry list of reasons never to trust the church. And so we also just have to move more slowly in my demographic and my community than we might in like, you know, a white upper middle class suburban context, for example, which is what a lot of church planting materials are geared towards.
Okay, so you mentioned not much denominational pressure, and it kind of relates to a question I was going to ask you here. I'll just say, like, I love your branding. Like, your website is fabulous. The imagery and graphics and branding is fabulous. I'm not an artist myself per se, but I love good branding. To that point, something that I heard myself, and I'm curious if you heard it, was the kind of like, hey, where's the denominational logo in our branding?
Yep. Yeah. Luckily, I don't think that anyone, again, lack of oversight, I don't think that anyone who would be mad at me is actually even knows our website. So there's that. But yeah, I mean, I think what's fascinating, it depends on what you're trying to do as a church plant.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and I think that it makes perfect sense. Let's say you're a United Methodist, you're very identified with United Methodism, but you want to change the denomination. You want to radicalize United Methodists. Great.
Mm-hmm.
Put the logo on, bring out all the people who are ready to make a change and radicalize the Methodist Church.
Yeah.
But that's not my call. That's not my mission.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to be United Methodist, having been Lutheran and evangelical and whatever. I see so many beautiful parts of each tradition. But I am extraordinarily grateful for the Wesleyan tradition and the theology that I was taught at a United Methodist seminary. But the polity is like, it's crumbling, it's bureaucratic, it is slow.
Yeah.
People who are identified with United Methodism sometimes are considerably more identified with United Methodism than they are with Jesus, which again is just not my jam.
Yeah.
And then, you have these profound gaps. So, for instance, in Wisconsin, there is a really troubling history of the United Methodist Church financially and otherwise divesting from Milwaukee and bringing those resources to other rural, more white parts of the state.
Yeah.
So, like, the Methodism doesn't mean a whole lot in the city of Milwaukee. Methodism certainly doesn't mean a lot to people who haven't grown up in the church at all.
Yep.
And it doesn't really mean much to people who grew up in, an evangelical or Southern Baptist or, Wells or Catholic, So what I feel called to do is bring people newly into a relationship with Jesus, or bring people newly into a healthy relationship with Jesus and the church. And the result of that, we did a poll. It was a couple years ago now, so we should do it again. But we did a poll once at Zao asking, if Zao didn't exist, how often do you expect you would attend some other religious institution?
Yeah.
And it was about 12% of our folks said that they would regularly attend some other church.
Wow.
And most said that they wouldn't go, or they wouldn't know where to go.
Yeah.
And the vast, vast majority of our community was not affiliated with any church for years before they became a part of Zao.
Right.
And that's my little evangelical beating heart there. Like the thing that the evangelicals taught me was to spread the gospel. And to have the story and message and love of Jesus, reaching places that it wasn't previously reaching.
Yeah.
And for me, what that means, what I'm called to, the gaps that I'm called to meet and love and preach to and build relationship with are among people who have been alienated or wounded or rejected by the church. And so putting my denominational symbol on our branding is not invitational to any of those people.
Yeah.
It's not even meaningful to most of them.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that's kind of what I expected to hear. I'm ordained in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and we have this chalice thing. And again, to me, I think it kind of looks more like, to the unfamiliar, like the Fragile logo on packaging, or it's just not. No offense to folks who are diehard Methodists or Disciples of Christ or whatever denomination you are. Like, as you mentioned, like people who are outside these contexts, that these logos don't mean anything to them.
Well, and sometimes can be harmful, right? So, like, I'm a United Methodist. Our logo is the cross and flame.
Yeah.
Right? And so to a United Methodist, a cross with a flame on it might mean something really great. But, to, for instance, members of our community, Black members of our community that have grown up in white spaces that actually have little weird northern havens of the KKK, a burning cross doesn't really seem great.
Yeah.
There's a lot of conversation in the United Methodist Church being like, hey, our logo is pretty tone deaf. Our logo is pretty harmful in certain spaces. But the love of Methodism and the kind of like team spirit and cultural identity has won out over and over again. And, again, if your call is to play within the team and radicalize it and grow it, great.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to reach people who are not already affiliated, it can be a real barrier.
Yeah. All right. Let me ask you to this if I can. I imagine there's plenty of things perhaps, or maybe a few things, I don't know, you can share. Something you would do differently, or looking back, you're like, well, that did not work at all.
Yeah. I mean, so this is going to be really niche, but like when I was at my first church plant, I kind of found my place in leadership by doing small group development, curriculum, and growth. I started a small group, and it grew, and so I split it, and then it grew, and I ended up kind of having a network of half a dozen small groups. That, I ran a group of the leaders of those groups, and then they ran their groups. It was this very deep discipleship program that had, 50 or 60 people in it. And that felt really great. And I was like, this is evidence that I can start something, And so I came to Milwaukee with the plan of basically doing that. And then I realized that like the church that I had been in, which was, this church plant in Chicago was incredible, and it created a room in my imagination for the possibility that I could be a part of the church as a member or as a leader. But it was mostly reaching people who were more churched. It was mostly reaching, straight folks, cis folks. And when I came to Milwaukee, I started almost church plants tend to reflect the identities of their planters. Yeah. And so as somebody deeply embedded in the justice and activism world, I was bringing in secular activists. As a queer person, I was bringing in a lot of queers. As a trans person, I was bringing in a lot of trans people. And because of kind of like overlapping identities there, we had a lot of neurodivergence. We had a lot of folks with disabilities. So we had a lot of people who were not prepared to just jump into a small group and have a prayer partner and pray out loud and read the Bible without a whole lot of guidance. That just wasn't going to work for them. And I tried it anyway for years. Yeah. I kept organizing these small groups over and over again with the same kind of, hopes and expectations, and just minor tweaks. So, I wish that I had recognized sooner that my people needed something different. And I think that there was a lot of pain there because my partner and I, Cameron, and I were both really passionate about discipleship. And we had found a depth of faith, a depth of connection and support and love in small groups. And so we wanted that for our people. So we tried really hard to make that work. And it wasn't until literally this year that we started having these conversations and saying, hey, maybe discipleship actually means something different for, a queer and trans person of color who grew up in white evangelicalism, who was dipping a toe back into what it means to even be in church with other people in person. Like maybe the risks that we're asking people to take are the wrong ones, and we need to honor the risks that they are taking as acts of faith and discipleship. Yeah, it's good. And still create opportunities for other people who want to go deeper in different ways. But we need to recognize, what risks people are taking to follow Jesus, and really strip away our expectations of what that looks like. Yeah.
Great observations. Thanks for sharing that. Let me ask you one more question here before we take a break. So again, as I mentioned before we started recording, this podcast really takes aim at trying to be a resource for pastors and church leaders trying to renew or bring renewal or new things to their congregation or church starts. What would be a word of encouragement or advice to someone who's maybe looking to do something new, within or without or outside of their congregation, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I think, the world is really attuned to what is possible right now.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that we got a lot of messaging around what has worked,
Mm-hmm.
without a lot of faith in what could work. And so I think that, part of being a disciple, part of being faithful is having a prophetic imagination
Mm-hmm.
and opening oneself to the possibility of what God is doing in the world and taking risks. And part of taking risk is knowing that if you try something, if you experiment and it doesn't give you the results you want, that doesn't mean it's a failure. And I think that one of the reasons, kind of getting back to that denominational pressure to go to worship, for instance, their denominations invest money into church plants. If they invest money into church plants, they expect a return on every investment.
Right.
And that's just not how risky, prophetic, experimental church planting goes.
I mean, that's not how anything goes, even in the business world, right?
Ever. Yeah, exactly. And so I had a colleague once tell me that he considered church planting the research and development arm of the church.
Yeah.
And that you don't expect that every experiment, every research results in a banger, Like it's about, and we still talk about experimenting here at Zao. We say we're trying something. And even if you want to put it in the harshest terms, failure, so to speak, is informative. It is, it's helpful. And so if we can take risks knowing that like any information we get from that is a success,
Mm-hmm.
and we have the support to be able to iterate on that and grow from that, I think that's what we're called to do, is we're called to try.
Yeah.
And we really need more support and more cultural acceptance of like, things going many different ways.
Well, that's a word. I appreciate you sharing that. Let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with the Reverend Jonah P. Overton, and really, really appreciate this conversation. Really appreciate your perspectives here. Closing questions here. I always tell listeners you can take these, guests, you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what would that day look like for you?
Yeah, I think if I were Pope for a day, we've got a Pope right now. Francis does a lot of interesting stuff, and he'll say things like, LGBT people are beloved, and
Mm-hmm.
then have to like walk them back.
Yeah.
So I would just gather all the most radical things, inclusive and affirming and justice-oriented things that the Pope has already said, and I would just say them all in order and be like, I take nothing back. I actually believe this. The end. Yeah.
Good. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Yeah. So as a person engaged in justice work, and we do a lot of anti-racism work
Mm-hmm.
at Zao, and we talk about solidarity. So, there's the liberation tradition of Christian theology
Mm-hmm.
that has really influenced my faith. As I mentioned at the very beginning, the political struggles in Latin America and the way that the church showed up to defend the poor.
Yeah.
There's a lot of incredible theology that came out of that time as well. And that liberation theology has really influenced me, and Black liberation theology in the States. And so we talk here at Zao about liberation and the kingdom being, the kingless kingdom, the kingdom, the fulfillment of God's intention for creation as being a place where all are made free. But we talk about how none of us can be free until all of us are free. And that is solidarity.
Yeah.
And so really, being fully alive, that, pursuing that kind of Zao idea, being among the living, you can't be fully alive without being among the living, right?
Yeah.
It's not, salvation is not an individual project.
Yeah.
Salvation is what God is doing, for all of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we believe that no one can be free until all are free, that no one is saved until the cosmos is saved,
Yeah.
then we're obligated to do some really earthly work of justice and anti-oppression. And when I think about a historical figure who has really embodied that or led in that way, but wasn't able to lead in the fullness of I think what God had intended, I think of Fred Hampton, who was a 21-year-old Black Panther who was working with marginalized Black folks, Latinos, and poor white folks, saying, "Hey, actually, we all have a lot in common. We all need to be in solidarity."
Yeah.
And actually, it was this very anti-empire, like it is the powers of domination that pit us against one another.
Yeah. And
in that very similar fashion, it was Hoover's FBI that murdered Fred Hampton when he was 21.
Wow.
So I would love to, to give Fred Hampton a second shot, another shot, a further shot at fulfilling his call to unify people around a message of solidarity and liberation.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing that. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think there's a lot going on right now. We're in an extraordinary time of transition.
Yeah.
And I think that we sometimes don't think about how technology is changing us.
Yeah.
I'm 35 and I remember not having the internet in my house.
Yeah.
I'm 35. I
remember. On your phone?
I remember not having cell phone. I mean, I remember my dad getting the family's first cell phone.
Yeah.
So I think that the ways that we relate to each other are changing very rapidly.
Yeah.
And I think that when people look back on this, it will seem quaint. I mean, like, it will be hard to remember, honestly. Mm-hmm. Like, we think about, I don't know, like I'm on social media, and I'm a person who probably wouldn't be on social media if it weren't part of my call and vocation.
Sure, right.
And I said that to one of my community members recently, and she was like, "Oh man, there was a time when you didn't have to be on social media to pastor."
Yeah.
And I was like, "What was that even like?" And the answer is, I could ask my dad. He could tell me what it was like to be a pastor with a telephone but no computer.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have no idea. And that's just, a generation ago. So I think this is a really pivotal moment for how we relate to one another, how we grow communities, and how we gather in order to worship.
Yeah. All right. Something hopeful. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
We didn't get a whole lot into this, and folks can hear more about this if they kind of get to those other channels of mine. But a big part of my understanding of the kingdom is the centering of the marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Jesus demonstrates what it means to build a community organization, a movement, a church, a body, beginning with those folks who were most on the outskirts and most marginalized. My hope is that actually through technology, in some ways, even through, podcasting, whatever,
mm-hmm.
access to books and access to just different corners of the world, that the church will learn how to center voices that have been discarded or buried.
Mm-hmm.
And, so on my own podcast, Jonah and the Peacock, that's the whole point, is to say, hey, we're going to bring people with marginalized identities who have radically different experiences of and takes on faith, who read the Bible differently than the dominant culture. And we're gonna bring their stories into focus and tell those stories, from our own experiences, listen from our experiences of privilege, and learn what it means to follow Jesus from the margins by accessing, listening to, and learning from people who are who have not been given the mic.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Speaking of, you mentioned your different channels and your podcast. Share with our listeners, what those channels are, how they can connect with you, and learn more about the church if they'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. So anybody who wants to learn about the church can find us at zaomke.org. We're also Zao MKE Church on Facebook and YouTube. We have all of our services completely digital as well. And we have a pretty big online community that isn't ever in person in Milwaukee because they don't live here or, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So zaomke.org. That's also the church's handle. We're on TikTok, which has been pretty fun, and Instagram.
How I found you, I think, was on TikTok.
Yeah. And then I am also on TikTok and Instagram at Rev_Jonah. And then again, we have found that to reach people, to tell stories, to do the kind of radical work of solidarity that we believe podcasting is really powerful. And so I mentioned my long form interview podcast, Jonah and the Peacock. But we also, Cameron and I, my partner and I, have a podcast that comes out much more regularly. We did like a season of Jonah and the Peacock. We're working on season 2 right now.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have this sometimes weekly, sometimes bi-weekly short form called Christian Queeries, spelled Queeries, keep the queer in Queeries, where we, we just kind of take questions of faith and kick them around from our perspective as queer trans people.
Yeah. That's
a little lighter and a little more fun. But it's a way to engage theologically. Again, what our goal was to say, hey, we have some conversations around the dinner table a lot that then come up and people are asking us about and whatever. And like, what if we just recorded it? So there is this very like, come join us for coffee, come sit around the dinner table with us and talk about, what is atonement and why baptism and how do you read the Bible and what are God's pronouns and those kinds of things. So you can find us at Christian Queeries for that podcast.
Awesome. Well, if you haven't already, send me those links and let's make sure we get them in the show notes
Absolutely.
when this comes out. Otherwise, really appreciate your time. This has been a great conversation. And I always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.